almost the polar opposite of public clouds, and they may not be as efficient as public clouds because data and systems is segmented into dedicated resource, not a shared environment. So obviously this is going to be the most secure, but the most costly. Hybrid clouds are more of the tailored solution where you're going to identify the data and systems that you are comfortable with being on a public and those that should be in a private to reach a blended solution. And then lastly, partners, or sometimes called community clouds, are those cloud systems that are uniquely designed for an industry or data set regardless of client. These are pretty interesting, and I actually will focus a little bit on those in the next section. Regarding the delivery models, there are three as well. Now, delivery models are what service is actually provided, and the key risk here is based on control, which we'll touch on in the next slide. First, we'll touch on infrastructure as a service. This is where the vendor is the owner of the physical location of the data storage and cloud. So they provide the security, power, computing, and network services. However, the client designs the platform and service hosted within the infrastructure. So in this instance, think they're providing the building, they're providing the electricity, you're designing what the office space looks like. Secondly, we have platforms as a service, which are most common in software development or for clients that have proprietary technology. And in this case, the cloud provider would provide the infrastructure, but also the development environment to create your applications. And lastly, the most common or prolific today is software as a service. This is what you're going to be most familiar with. It's mostly what is used for a lot of reasons, which we'll touch on briefly. But this is where a cloud provider is going to provide all of the infrastructure, all of the platform, and the hosting environment, and usually the security and the updating and the processes to provide a fixed software solution into your company. Now, this is, you think about Office 365, Salesforce. You'll hear some other common names out there. Now, digging into those individually. We'll touch on each one. First, private clouds are, again, the most secure because your data and systems are isolated. Now, for risk managers, the first thing you should think about is if you have sensitive information, the most likely home for them is in a private cloud. Now, it's a highly sensitive information. It doesn't mean they must be in private clouds because you can design a cloud system that is secure and monitored to meet your needs. Again, public clouds are perhaps the most cost-effective, but you would have less control here, which doesn't necessarily mean less secure, but more scrutiny should be placed when you're using public clouds. Hybrids, again, are the tailored solutions, which are most effective for companies balancing risk and efficiency, but I do want to focus a bit on the partner and community clouds, which can provide you potentially compliance assurance with sensitive data. I will dig into this a bit further, but if you're in the financial industry, you'll note that there are some cloud service providers that can provide you FCA compliant solutions by using their hosted services. It's very similar with electronic medical records as well. When we turn to delivery models, this is something that's very common in the IT world, referred to as the cloud stack. If you look at the pyramid on the right, you'll see that infrastructure is at the bottom and software is at the top, and it goes from the bottom to top based on control. So with infrastructure as a service, the entity, the client, has the most control in how it's delivered, and with software as a service, they would have the least control. Now, what's important here to differentiate for a risk manager is when you're using software as a service, you'll want to understand what processes are in place for the software provider to patch vulnerabilities, to monitor for usage guidelines, to know what information is stored and who owns it, which we'll touch all of those in the best practices. One more thing on that, I'll just, as I think about this, one of the most practical ways to think about the cloud is to consider security and compliance a shared responsibility. And so for a moment, think about within the private cloud, the client or enterprise is responsible for creating and managing the configuration and security. So your compliance division, your security division, your IT department should be working hand in glove with the service provider to design the solution that's fit for purpose. Now, the question we're going to ask in a moment is about vendor management, and it comes in very clear here when we talk about that hand in glove relationship. That risk management should be looking holistically across the organization to make sure that sensitive data has been identified, critical systems have been identified, the user environment has been assessed, and then that appropriate security has been put into place. This, of course, goes doubly for those systems that are hosted in the public cloud, like Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure, where the vendor is going to have the infrastructure and physical network, and you're only buying access to it. But especially, let's look at it for software as a service again, because this is most common. The vendor, you're going to be able to want to look at not just contracts, but potential user agreements to see who owns data, where it's processed, where it's held, contractual clauses, as well as any risks or liability that are shifted. Turning to digital transformation for a moment, I want to ask, look at sort of where we're at today. So based on the Cloud Industry Forum's recent Cloud UK white paper, where they polled companies of varying size of industry, 44% of companies have now defined a digital transformation policy. Not shocking. 57% say improving technology use and cost was a key objective for this year. And 47% seek to improve business agility and use of big data. But what I find most interesting about these numbers is that they're actually low, because the people behind the technology, the millennials coming into the workforce, technology innovation, can't be ignored any longer. I look at us in the insurance industry, where InsurTech is beginning to make some major disruptions in the space, because we're trying to adopt more efficient delivery models to drive down underwriting costs, to drive down expense, particularly because capital is cheap. But so the question's begged: why aren't companies adopting this at a higher rate? Why is that number only 44% that have a digital transformation policy? Well, from the same study, 62% say data and system security are a major inhibitor, which is not surprising when it comes to cloud. Security wants for segmentation and isolation, while the cloud relies on shared environments for scale and efficiency. 35% say cost and lack of budget, which is something as an insurance underwriter we hear quite a bit from our clients, where insurance budgets may not match IT budgets, and IT budgets are under pressure as well. And lastly, approximately 30% say integration challenges, legacy system migration issues are causing the biggest headache. And I agree, those can be big hurdles. The real challenge is particularly for large, well-established enterprises. The legacy system challenges, for instance, is perhaps the most remarkable, because it can seem insurmountable to move off a system that's 10, 20, or even 30 years old. The risk of migration issues, losing data integrity from back office to front office, product delivery, finance, it seems to put projects in eternal delay. What this has created, unfortunately, is a patchwork of cloud adoption, where IT departments are finding quick fix solutions or perhaps targeted solutions in certain areas to improve efficiencies at the points with the least friction. For instance, you may decide only to move email and attachment storage to the cloud, create shared or drive access across individual locations, moving media housing, or using online apps to create advertising. Front office sales management or customer relationship software may move to the cloud as well. So we're in a spot where it is very challenging to integrate risk management when the IT department is creating patchwork solutions because there are these significant efficiency grabs that can be targeted in certain areas.
Okay, so it's now over to you, the audience, for your views through a short poll. So this will appear on your screens just now. So to what extent do you work with your IT colleagues on addressing cloud-related risks? If you make your selection now, and we'll give you a few seconds to do that. Okay, so we're about to share the results of this short poll. If you haven't made your selection, we'll give you a couple more seconds to do so. So Carl, looking at the results, you see the vast majority here, 67% say they have occasional collaboration, and then the rest of our respondents have no relationship at all. So does this sort of tally with the sort of conversations you have with your clients about working with their IT colleagues?
Yeah, it's pretty consistent. I mean, it's pretty intimidating, it's what we hear at least, that risk managers is a pretty intimidating proposition to step into an IT department that's undergoing constant change to insert yourself into a process, because oftentimes you're creating it from scratch. You know, the IT department speaks in different languages than risk management. It can be even further concerning where perhaps risk management has an isolated role in the organization. But digital transformation is forcing us to rethink you know, how we approach these exposures. No longer are we talking about paper files. You know, that's gone. Those days are gone. And it's even more so important that there is a significant leakage when it comes to information the more connected you are. And that's what I'm going to focus on in the next moment. But it is we know it's a challenge, and that's what makes, you know, this type of, you know, presentation hopefully we give enough for risk managers to walk away with and just start the conversation.
Yes, indeed. And Carl, just looking at that 33% who currently don't have any relationship with their IT department, what would you kind of advise our members when they're thinking about how they can begin that conversation with their IT team?
Yeah, you know, it's not an easy step. I think the first thing you have to think about is you can focus on some regulatory changes that are coming. That may be that may be the impetus you need to drive that initial conversation. I mean, if you look at, you know, some of the recent guidance, this board level guidance, that the board members have a responsibility to identify, you know, network security obligations. You see, you know, the GDPR coming in May of 2018. You see the regulations in the U.S. It's no longer just an IT issue. It's a holistic organizational issue. You know, the other thing at the end of the day is there's always a person behind the computer screen, right? The user behavior piece is it can't be ignored. And that's something, you know, people, process, and technology is something we speak about a lot when it comes to risk management. And I think, unfortunately, that technology piece seems the most out of reach.
Yes.
And I think that the regulatory piece can actually start driving the conversation for us.
Absolutely, and just on the point about board and getting their involvement, I mean, that's got to be critical in a sort of cyber-related strategy. Is there anything that the risk managers can do to improve that engagement with the board?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, what we're actually seeing is that the board members are recognizing the issue. And they're looking for ownership within the organization, and I think that, you know, risk management plays a key part right now, because there are a lot of solutions in the insurance industry actually to actually marry that up. You know, one of the ways that I encourage them to is to reach out to the risk management and insurance community and you know, ask about engineering services, for instance, because, you know, there are companies that have resources that can help you bridge that gap and drive the conversation.
Great. And on that note, shall we move on to the rest of the presentation?
Of course. So we had this conversation about, you know, why this is important to you, and I do want to focus for a second on the scary side of it. You know, a recent study by Sky High showed that an average organization uses 1,427 or 1,427 cloud services. And I know that number seems ridiculously large, but consider that Gmail, YouTube, Office 365, Adobe, file storage, development programs can all be cloud-based. And that's even before we consider any enterprise-specific applications. You also have to think that the definition of cloud services, again, has expanded to most colloquially include any hosted IT service. You know, the adoption of cloud is not a choice anymore. Your employees are doing it already. The question is more or less, do you have the inventory of what systems, what is being used, how are you managing the risk of those individuals using it? Another thing to consider, perhaps even more worryingly so, is that half of the number of clouds used are personal or consumer use. Now, we can use some security protocols to restrict access on workstations to most of these services. But it is more complicated on mobile devices. It's more complicated with bring your own device policies, as well as it's not practical to block users from most of these services. So really, it's not a question of whether or not your enterprise has adopted the cloud, but how you ensure your data and systems are secure, that your user behavior falls in line with your organization's expectations. The same study by SkyHigh also indicated that 18.1% of all data stored or uploaded by an employee contains sensitive or confidential information. Now that is quite high, but I want to point you back to the chart before. What's the most scary about that is we're talking about companies in some instances that are uploading 25 terabytes to clouds each year. So it can be a significantly large number, and even the smallest leakage there can put you in regulatory hot water. So we've seen the impetus to adopt and manage the cloud, but we still need to fully appreciate the benefits. And this is where I go into, you need the ammunition to be able to show IT that you have an appreciation of what the cloud is, its enormous benefits that it can have for the organization, which is primarily cost savings, and that is not just in the initial cost or usage, but also in potential security. While looking at the risks in a realistic and reasonable way. So let's start off looking at the benefits. Starting with the most obvious, reduce costs. This is the one you'll hear the most. It's the biggest benefit, and it's also the biggest challenge of a good risk manager, because as you know, we hear this from our risk managers, that when cost becomes the focus of a business decision across any sector of the organization, it is perhaps the biggest challenge to manage that exposure. So it is a reality, particularly when you'll see the remaining benefits, that the cost argument is the biggest hurdle for us as risk managers. So going into a reasonable approach, I think about things that are checklists, processes, vendor management guidelines that have been updated to be relevant for the cloud. Those types of things are going to come into play because reduced costs are the biggest benefit. But if you look at the next ones, you're going to see some things that are very, very attractive. Capability, scalability, and speed. Cloud delivery models are almost a necessity now just to keep pace. Cloud can provide some needed agility. I'll give you an example. Nowadays, when you open an office in a new location, there's no need to set up much on-location IT, so it's very lean to open up a new office. The cloud is very agile in that way. And even security now can be done remotely through a managed security provider. So there's very little on-site hardware that's necessary to open a new location. System security and backup. It's a unique one, and I'll tell you, don't lose sight of this. It will be both in the risks and the benefits. Companies, cloud providers can invest more heavily in security oftentimes than you can. They tend to provide their system security, to make sure their system security is very high because they're looking to maintain uptime efficiencies, meet SLA requirements. But it does not mean that security is fit for your purpose or your needs. It's meant to provide the system itself and the software with the most security for everyone. Availability and mobility, I sort of go back to capability as well. But when you're buying into the cloud, you're buying into some geographic redundancies that would typically be impossible, particularly for companies that don't have a geographic spread. Asking the question as an underwriter, do you have geographic redundancies that's out of weather patterns, beyond reach of a single catastrophic event or power outage? You don't have to ask that when you're using a good cloud service provider that has multiple locations. But there's some risks there as well. We'll talk about it in a little bit, like data transfer issues, data provenance as well. And then lastly, regulatory compliance. Now, I know you may be thinking, I've used that as a risk as well. Again, though, it's an area I encourage you to explore, because if you're in certain industries where there may be a community regulatory burden, there's oftentimes a cloud provider or an IT provider that can actually provide you a compliance assurance solution. And this is more importantly with the GDPR. Processors and controllers under the new GDPR can be held equally liable in Europe. So it may be a good option to find those cloud providers that are willing to provide you that assurance as well.
Okay, so we've just heard about the benefits of cloud computing, and we are just about to move on to consider the risks. But before we do that, another poll question for you, which is focused on risk. So of the following, what is the #1 cloud-related risk for your business? If you select from one of the following. Okay, we're about to share the results. So if you haven't participated, please do so now. Okay, so looking at the results, Kyle, 92% selected data security. I would guess that that doesn't come as a surprise to you.
No, you hear me laughing a bit, but it's so appropriate. I mean, everyone's concerned about data security right now. The General Data Protection Regulation puts up a lot of uncertainty right now. The risk we faced in the U.S. in the past few years, a lot of them going through vendors like payment service providers, for payment processors. We've seen the recent incidents at Amazon Web Services or other vendors like that. And yes, there's a major concern for it, and it's completely reasonable.
And not to take too much away from the next slide, but we've got a couple of selections here that haven't been selected. So exclusion in contracts, our members don't consider that to be a big risk, nor do they consider aggregation risks to be a major threat for their company. Should they be worried about these two threats?
The contracts particularly. I think the contracts in the context of the GDPR are going to be a pretty unique development. We'll have to see where the processors are willing to renegotiate on those points, because there is some new responsibilities under the General Data Protection Regulation that are going to throw some of those contractual clauses into question. The other thing about the contractual issues is that contractual terms have been very, very favorable to cloud providers over the years, and there's some arguments on the side by the cloud providers that is the only way that their business model works. But I think you're going to see, as we put more scrutiny on data protection, that we bring some of those clauses to the light and start to renegotiate them. And aggregation risks is one of those where I think there's a strategic reason for companies to be concerned about this. It may not be an immediate challenge, but there is a question there to be had that if one of my vendors goes down, is there a backup through a second one that makes sense? If the entire industry chooses the same vendor, have I created a honeypot for an attacker to hit and affect my entire industry? What is my backup plan there? Is there a possibility to select another vendor that may not be as penetrated across the industry but be able to provide me the same solution? So if, those are the types of risks that I think may not be on the radar right now because they're being clouded by data security, but they are issues that should be considered in the vendor management process.
Brilliant, great. So that does lead us nicely on to the next slide, which focuses on those risks.
Yes. So we're going to start. We're going to start where we just were. First and foremost, I should say, as an underwriter, the contracts are a major concern for us. They've historically, again, been very favorable. And cloud vendors will argue when you talk to them that if they accepted liabilities or made guarantees as related to data security, they would not have an efficient cost model for clients. Now, most of these contracts limit liability to fees or credits, because remember that they're billed on a metered or usage basis. So they use credits in order, rather than to pay liability or take on any liability. Now that may be true that that their business model wouldn't work if they took on that liability, but those caps on liabilities, those credit-based acceptances, leave client with little avenue of recovery, regardless of what has been decided in regards to security responsibility. And we just encourage clients, particularly large global companies, to place some extra scrutiny there. To start using your leverage for, you're paying these companies large amounts of money, and to put very sensitive data in the cloud, knowing that with the general data protection regulation upcoming, that you could be putting yourself at significant risk of fine or penalty, that you need to have some shared responsibility, and that doesn't mean just talking about having shared responsibility, but actually put it into writing. Secondly, and I saw some notes here on loss of control. One of the problems with the cloud applications is who owns the data uploaded into them. Now we go back to earlier when we talked about how half of all cloud providers that a company is using are consumer or for personal use. Now, with most personal use applications, you'll note, and this is very famous back when the Facebook terms and conditions came out, that Facebook owned all your photos, if you remember, and Facebook took some flack for that. Knowing who owns your data, how to access it, what happens if you need to perform an investigation, knowing can you interrogate a system to determine what its backup capabilities are, what type of bandwidth it may have. That type of control that would generally exist if you owned the system, if you owned the infrastructure, doesn't exist there. So being able to ask the right questions is important. Nextly, data security. Everyone is already seeing that. Now, I did mention it as a benefit. I think part of the reason everyone notices that it's the biggest risk is just because we don't have a good picture of where our data is, where it sits, and what is actually at risk. That conversation needs to happen at the beginning, and I would encourage everyone just to set a meeting up and you ask, as we would as an underwriter, what are your crown jewels? What's the data that's most secure? What is the system that's most secure or highest criticality? And what steps have you taken to make sure that there isn't leakage into systems that are less secure? That includes user behavior monitoring, access control. It means vendor management questionnaires, heavy due diligence, as well as the ability to audit them. And so I'll leave it at that because I've already mentioned quite a bit about it. Hidden costs is something that I think that from a risk management perspective, perhaps it's not on the radar, but one of the things that we've noticed with a lot of cloud providers over the years is that there are additional fees that may accompany the request, and it even drives up potential claims costs. Because when you have a cost of an investigation that includes perhaps data transferred into multiple locations, access to those systems can be quite challenging. In order to perform a clear investigation or to make disclosures to a regulator, it can be quite a bit more challenging. So understanding what type of access is available and the cost of that. So if the cloud provider is going to do that information for you, they may charge you for it. So it's an easy way just to say, if I need to have access to the information, how much are you going to charge me for a data extract? The final risk we're looking at, of course, is aggregation. I mentioned it just a moment ago, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but it is really the concept of just looking at holistic risk for your industry. It's something that it's an easier conversation. It's more high level, but if you do look at these cloud providers that have heavy concentrations in certain industries, there is a question to ask there of how at risk is my business by selecting a vendor that multiple banks, for instance, are selecting, or multiple, defense contractors or healthcare providers are selecting, that makes that vendor a higher target for hacks. So we've looked at cloud models, state of the market, benefits, risks, and I wanted to spend the last part of this is really giving you some takeaways, just answering the questions of what do I do about it. And now I've divided the first best practices here into two sections. The first is, what as a risk manager can I do at home? We know clouds are already being used. We know that IT is adopting these digital transformation is here. It's happening, and it may be happening in a patchwork way. That doesn't mean you adopt a digital transformation policy. But a cloud usage and implementation policy is key. We're going to talk a little bit about what are the things we can do here. So let's first look at home. We're going to start by talking about the organizational challenge. This is the ultimate question when I ask an underwriter when referring to risk to me. Does the client have an appreciation for the exposures? And have they designed a culture of privacy and security such that we're confident no matter how the technology changes over the next 12 months that the approach will remain the same? Building an adoption of a privacy culture from the top down, and this means going to the board level and down, from back office to front office, will better prepare companies for digital transformation and adoption of any IT and cloud providers in the future. Secondly, and you'll also see this when I talk about risk management in the cloud, is you need to map your systems, inventory your data, inventory what's being used. Focus on the areas of criticality first. That's where I, as an underwriter, would focus. And then focus as well on what regulators would think is your area of criticality. Because those two may not be aligned, and you need to know what jurisdictional, of course, exposures you may have that would answer those questions. Next is setting rules and training employees on what systems they can use. This could be as easy as saying don't go on Facebook, don't use Prezi or some other cloud-based presentation or video tool. These clean desk policies we used many years ago are no longer clean desktop policies. It's clean desktop policies. So it's a bit different, but we should be taking the same approach there. Due diligence and vendor management. This is a key one, and honestly it's a key frustration for me, and I'm hopeful that the next time we're doing this webinar we can say confidently that risk managers are heavily involved in vendor management. When we do talk to risk managers that are involved in the process, what we also hear from from risk managers is that the vendor management strategy is years old, decades old. It's not built for IT. It's not built for digital transformation as well. So I'd encourage risk managers just to begin that conversation with vendor management, with procurement, with whoever may be running that process, whether it be legal or otherwise, to begin that conversation. And then lastly, focusing on the contract, making sure you have good negotiators in the room that are working with IT to develop a shared responsibility for security and making sure the contract reflects it. So once you're in the cloud, what do you do? So let's say you've sort of buttoned up what you're doing at home on an everyday basis. You want to have and keep an inventory of your current approved clouds that have a cloud implementation procedure in place. You should be using a log management tool as well to pick up on cloud apps or user behavior online. Secondly, once identified and mapped, you should set security usage rules for the approved users, and that means password protocols. That means access control, just to make sure that who is accessing it internally, how they're accessing internally, is within your guidelines. Audit is the third one. I tell you, there are a lot of ways here to create some audits. You can also use a cloud access security broker or a managed security service provider to do that, perform that function for you. They work with cloud providers regularly, but having an audit function and being able to be agile and adjust as your business model changes with those cloud providers is important. Updating and formalizing incident response plans, business continuity plans, or disaster recovery plans to include your critical IT providers. Most companies are going to have these policies in place. They may be collecting dust. I'd encourage you just to pick them up and make sure that your critical IT is included in those plans. And lastly, develop an exit strategy. This is one thing that we talked about earlier as a key frustration when it comes to failure to adopt digital transformation technologies, is that migrating from legacy systems can be a biggest hurdle. Now I want you to put this out 10 or 12 years and say you've used a cloud provider, the same service provider, for 10 to 12 years, and that data is sitting on a third-party system. You can imagine what it's going to look like when you're trying to then again go through digital transformation in version 3.0, 4.0, or beyond. You should better know how easy it would be to extract yourself from the relationship, to have access to your data and your technology. Now to close, I'm going to leave you with a few checklists, and a few processes here that you can hopefully print this out, take home with you, and use in your everyday work. Now the first one you'll see is from a textbook on the cloud, and I think it's a pretty simple way to look at it. You'll see a lot of words there that risk managers are familiar with. Legal and privacy, for instance, procedural and operational process, security policies, standards, and guidelines. These are all things that risk managers can find common ground on with IT. And so if you have all of those people at the table, all of those topics at the table, when you get to cloud implementation, the rest of the hurdles after making that fit for purpose is just making sure that you have a change management guideline. So should your requirements change, you have a way to approach the cloud vendor and build in a remediation process, and as well as have an audit function, a way to evaluate them and review the controls that are in place so that you can have remediate it to continue to be fit for purpose. Oops. Sorry.
We're back up.
Sorry, guys. Just one moment. All right. That's it. Right there.
Okay, so let's get that back up there for you.
It's fine. I can go from there. It's fine. Yeah. So if you look at this cloud computing checklist, what I tried to do here is to give you sort of the key topics to actually drill down to the next level. Over that, I've given you sort of best practices for home, best practices within the cloud. I've given you the process by which cloud implementation matters. And then lastly, I want to just give you guys sort of the next level dive that says, well, here are the topics within the cloud implementation that I should be asking about, the hot topics. And the first ones here are regulatory compliance, of course, then data segregation, so knowing what data and systems are shared, what not shared, how they're segmented away from third-party information or from non-critical information, who has access to it. Data provenance. This is becoming more and more important in Europe as to where your information is actually sitting. If it contains personal data, you may have some obligations under new EU rules. Access privileges. Again, it's who has access to it. That means not only within your company, but within the cloud. So asking the cloud provider, how do they screen employees coming in? How do they, what are their procedures for hiring admins? What are their admin passwords, password protections in place? And then also doing it internally as well in your company. Monitoring and reporting, again, this is something that, since security is a shared responsibility, you should have regular audit contact with your cloud providers to make sure you're getting reports out about usage and making sure that any updates coming around patching, vulnerability updates, that you're able to talk with your IT department about those. Data recovery, again, we spoke about the exit plan. That cloud providers, large cloud providers, should be able to give you a walkthrough of data recovery procedures and include disclosing the costs of what those procedures would be. And then business continuity. Risk managers should ensure that their company's business continuity plan works together, hand in hand with the IT providers. If you're not buying good resiliency in the cloud, both geographic redundancy as well as real time, you're not getting as much value out of the cloud as you should. And lastly, I'm just going to leave you with this, not spend time before we take any more questions. But I don't think at this point any presentation would be worth its salt if we didn't discuss the GDPR. The ICO, the end of last year, put out this this slide or this handout that includes 12 steps to take now, and you'll notice some things in there that are very unique or could have significant impact when you're talking about sharing information on the third-party systems or in the cloud. Particularly access requests, again, knowing how to get your data out of a third party or out of a cloud to disclose to a regulator. I mentioned data breaches, being able to respond in 72 hours. You should know, is your cloud provider able to accommodate a data request within 72 hours to notify a regulator should you have an incident? And we'll talk about, as well as data provenance, knowing what information you hold and where it's at. So I'll leave it at that. Ken, any questions?
Great. We've got a couple of questions here. The point you made earlier about vendor management, in some cases not being built for digital transformation. What does a good vendor management plan look like generally?
Well, I'll start by saying what it doesn't look like. We talked to a client and their vendor management guidelines were the same for a caterer coming into their office as it was for an IT company. It was totally based on reputational, it was based on physical injury or bodily injury to individuals, and that wasn't really fit for purpose. I think with digital transformation, we're talking about all new things. I think a few years ago we went through the transformation of having, printers that were usually handled by procurement. We had copiers that were coming in, moving from fax machines that were collecting and holding information, and those became under the provenance of the IT department for the first time. So when I think about what does a vendor management guideline look like, I think the first thing it has to address is what risks does this vendor bring to us, no matter what service they're providing. So for instance, if they're just hosting an enterprise data warehouse, you should know what is the intent of our business when it comes to participating in this enterprise data warehouse. What data are we going to put there, and what's at risk there? And that should then define the due diligence. So that's going to beg the question: where does the data sit? How is it secured? How do we have access to it? And when you don't have the expertise, I think that's when you should perhaps start to contract with a managed security provider or a cloud access, security broker, so you can actually start having better conversations with those cloud providers.
So I guess the take home from this is if you've got a vendor management guideline that hasn't been looked at in the last decade, now would probably be a good time to do so.
Yeah, and I think it's a good question. I think we see regulators now becoming more and more inquisitive, we'll say, about what our approaches are as data becomes shared across multiple environments, right? And there's this reasonable question that was the reasonableness, term that's been thrown around in a lot of the negotiations with the GDPR and other privacy regulations as to what does that mean. Well, I think if you haven't assessed the risk when you're talking to the vendor, it's probably a bit unreasonable.
Yes, absolutely. And just one last question, Kyle, and this goes back to one of the earlier slides around digital transformation, and you shared some interesting statistics there, one of which being 44% of companies have a digital transformation strategy, which sounds like quite a big number. What role can risk managers play in kind of...
Yeah, and I actually go the other way. I say it's a very small number.
Right.
The fact that it's not most companies aren't going to have a formalized policy, but digital transformation is here. It's happening. I think it's very intimidating. I mean, as we talk to risk managers, they'll tell you that it's quite intimidating to walk across the room because it's almost like you're stopping business from happening, right? You don't want to be seen as slowing down a project that affects the bottom line. And we recognize that. It's something that's it's not an easy conversation to have. But we're at a point where I think if we don't take a step back, the risk is running away from us a bit, and it's going to get out of the hands of risk managers. A few years ago, we published a paper on the changing role of the risk manager. And I'd say it's true in a lot of organizations, but a lot of organizations are still playing catch up. And for us, I think as underwriters, I find one of the most fascinating parts of my job right now is being able to empower the risk manager to take on some things that are really difficult. We're regulatory scrutiny. We're talking about Regulation changes that are very populist and that are very protectionist right now. We're talking about aggressive regulators. We're talking about all of this happening in a recessionary environment in a lot of countries where companies are facing real challenges.
Yeah.
And even the little steps we can take to help a risk manager have that initial conversation can make significant changes. And we see that every day with our clients. Year after year, we're starting to see improvements. And anything we can do to accelerate that, the better.
And it's all happening so quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's a nightmare, and that's I go back to the underwriting question I ask my underwriters is that the only thing at the end of the day that matters to me is that we've asked the right questions and we're confident that in the next 12 months, no matter what happens from a digital transformations point of view, that the approach will remain the same. We're confident that's a reasonable approach. If we can be confident with that, I feel comfortable insuring the risk.
Brilliant. I think that's a lovely note to end on. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. Thank you very much, Kyle, for your input today. This webinar will be available on the AMIC website, and the address is on your screens now. The next webinar, the last in this series, will take place on Thursday, the 20th of April at the same time, same place, and that is looking at the digital future, which will focus on emerging risks, and that is being presented by Tim Mastley at Zurich. If you haven't registered for that webinar, please do so by following the link on your screen just there. Thank you once again for joining us for this webinar, and I hope to have you on the 20th of April. Thank you.